Hello, I'm Donnie Chan, Assistant Curator of Asian Art at the Walters Art Museum. Thank you all for joining us for today's talk, which is generously supported by the museum's Friends of Asian Art group. Just a reminder, we welcome questions throughout the talk. Please post them in the comments and we will answer them at the end during the Q&A. Now I am very pleased to introduce today's lecturer, Dr. Kurt Barron. Kurt is the Associate Curator of South Asian Art and has been at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York since 2006. He has successfully launched 9 exhibitions, including Buddhism Along the Silk Road in 2012, Seeing the Divine, Pahari Painting of North India in 2018, Sita and Rama in 2019, and the most recent, this year, Bodhisattvas of Wisdom, Compassion, and Power. Kurt has published widely on the art of the Indian subcontinent. Most recently, he did a survey of the Met's holdings entitled How to Read Buddhist Art. His PhD from UCLA focused on the Buddhist architecture of Gandhara. Please join me in welcoming Kurt Barron.
Thank you, and thank you so much for having me speak to you tonight. I'm excited. I'm going to be looking at a lot of painting that has been featured in recent shows, the Sita and Rama and Seeing the Divine shows that you were just mentioning, and so it's I'm very excited to dive in, and so maybe I will share my screen and we can begin. This concept of evoking the gods in Indian painting is something that rose out of this exhibition that I did back in 2018. And here you see Krishna and Radha. They're in this wonderful wooded landscape at night. She's we actually even know from the Gita Govinda, she is leading him home. And she stands very much in for the worshiper, right? Her devotion for Krishna is, I think, evident. I mean, she gazes into his eyes, and you know, there's this sort of charged romantic moment between the two. And this kind of depiction is at the root of a huge painting tradition, and I think it reflects the interests of the patrons who commissioned these works and their audiences, and to my mind, the painting we're looking at right now, which was done in around 1775, 1780, in the area of Kangra, is a sort of a high moment of Indian painting, and is the culmination of actually at this stage centuries of painting on paper substrate. But I get ahead of myself. Let me say a word or two of background. Painting on paper actually was kind of a new thing in India. We have wall paintings going back really to the 1st century AD in West India, works done on palm leaf. But with the development of paper, it changed the size that one could produce these works, and new materials came in. And this was particularly important in Persia. And when we have the Mughals, and my little blue spot here around Delhi and Agra, the area of sort of the seat of Mughal power, this dynasty was very much related and came out of this Persian world, was connected, and they controlled all of North India, this whole region, essentially everywhere north of the Narmada River. Anytime they tried to take territory south of the Narmada, it always ended up with whoever crossed that river breaking away and wanting to be independent. Now, the Mughals had many vassal states that were subservient to them, and notably the Hindu Maharajas of Rajasthan, Jaipur, Bikaner, Udaipur, all had independent painting traditions that drew on the sort of technical aspects of this Mughal painting tradition and blended it with these pre-existing, long-standing painting sort of ideas that had dominated North India, as I say, for centuries. We know so little about the precedent for all of this, because before this mobile form arose, in fact, we are limited to what survives on a wall here or there, or palm leaves that made their way to Tibet. The monsoon climate wasn't friendly to this kind of media. Now, the sort of a third school or a third region of painting that I want to focus on today is up here in the Pahari Hills of the foothills of the Himalayas, the Pahari-speaking region. And in these small valleys, sort of much smaller kingdoms were established, and they lacked the resources, certainly of the Mughals. I mean, when you think of the Mughals, Shah Jahan built the Taj Mahal. He credited himself with building 5 cities. In Rajasthan, this great fertile basin led to the production of thousands of paintings. Whereas up in the foothills, there these tiny valleys. And here you can get a sense of some of the major kingdoms, Mandi and Kangra, Gular. I'll especially talk about Kangra and Gular, Basoli. But these tiny valleys, while agriculturally rich, I mean, the Himalayas catch the monsoons, and there was always a lot of water. These are tiny little valleys, and relative to the rest of India, reasonably poor kingdoms. And they were isolated from the Mughals and from the Rajput kingdoms, sort of nestled up in these valleys. And you wouldn't expect them actually to be producing painting of great quality. And yet, I think because they lacked the resources to build massive palaces and things like that, they reciprocally, focused on painting and patronized artists. And there was a great, I think, dialogue between these rulers, these patrons, and artists who founded workshops. Let me begin at the beginning of the Pahari tradition. This wonderful page that you see here, it's part of a series of about 70 paintings that all represent different aspects of the goddess. They're tantric in nature. And on the back of each one is a verse that I think sets the stage nicely for how it might have been understood and used. This small verses read, "Equal to 1,000 rays of the rising sun, accompanied by 3 shining Kalis." So we're talking about these 3 goddesses here, Kali, who are offering cups of blood and this head. Worshipped by 2 bundles of kusha grass, she is everything. Her feet are worshipped by both Bhairavas, and this is a term for Shiva, and you see these 2 images here at her feet, accompanied by Bhima and Vahini Priya, and I like especially here this woman encased in flame. She banishes fear, adorned with the 22 letters, I adore Bhadrakali, and with the seed mantra. So very, I think, evocative, and tells you a lot of about what this patron was hoping to accomplish. If we look a bit closer, one of the things that strikes me about a painting like this is how related it is to the earlier sculptural traditions. I mean, the bronzes being cast in this region, stone sculpture. She stands, very iconically in a perfect profile with this wonderful halo and these rays of sun shining out, all done in gold. You can see already sort of the 3-dimensional quality too of these little blobs of calcium carbonate, and the little dimple that you can see sort of in each one, that give it a very much a textural 3-dimensional quality. And sadly, I mean, in my slide, it's very hard to catch the luminosity of this cut beetle wing, but maybe just get a glint here. This is all quite green, and if you were to see this under the raking light, it's luminous. And this kind of depiction with its saturated background, I think is something that we can look at as setting an earlier precedent, something that predated really the Mughal tradition. Even if it is being now painted on a paper substrate, it's almost as though we can look to Tibet, where similar initiation cards done in a square format with these same strong red borders were used in Buddhist tantric ritual to align oneself with the gods. So functioning in a similar way, and just on the other side of the Himalayas. But certainly the rich yellow sort of color field that frames the goddess is something that we would expect from India. This Indian yellow actually fluoresces in the light and is bright in a way that very few colors produced in today. We don't see this kind of pigment. And in fact, it's a pigment that we've lost the recipe. I mean, it seems as though one feeds cows mango leaves and collects the urine and then dries that out, and then this is ground and serves as this form of pigment. And yet, people haven't really had a terrible success at creating it today. Many of the other pigments that we see here are mineral and vegetable. A lot of the reds being oxides, the green again an oxide of copper, and so on. So this palette, I think, is also quite interesting and varies from one of these kingdoms to the next. And I find these various figures. Keep in mind also that this painting is really only maybe 5 inches across, and so the level of detail is really quite stunning. Now, that was done in 1570. What am I saying? 1750. And by 1640, we're seeing paintings like this one from Mandi. Now, this is an artist that we think probably came right out of the Imperial Mughal workshops. He traveled. I assume these are male artists. All of the named artists that we know of are men. Traveled to the site of Mandi and for a generation, really pretty much an isolated generation, produced a handful of paintings in this Mughal sort of vocabulary. The green of the background, for instance, I think it's very indicative of the Mughal workshops. The attention to observe nature and the way these trees are depicted. Perhaps most striking is this new figural form. While I hardly think about these women as being realistic, sort of drawn from life figures, certainly it's a way of depicting the human form that is much more realistic. The story of this painting is that Krishna encounters the gopis, these cow herdesses, and they're bathing, and he steals their clothes and takes them up into a tree, and they're modest and they don't want to leave the water, but again, it's this idea of bhakti and devotion to Krishna, and eventually they emerge from the water. This is a scene from a text called the Bhagavata Purana. And is a way of depicting Krishna in relationship to the gopis that was very common across. You see it in a few Mughal paintings, in fact, even though they're an Islamic dynasty. But certainly across Rajasthan, you will find this exact idea, this format. This scene is chosen for depiction, and here we're finding it merging in the Pahari Hills and being repeated. And this, I think, is an important issue because one thing that we can say about the Pahari rulers and probably also their Rajput counterparts, they were very versed in these texts. They clearly were read either they read them themselves, or there were moments where someone read passages from these texts, and so the subtlety, the nuance, the stories were something that people were very familiar with, and immediately could identify small pieces of iconography. Here we have the Rasalila from 1750. It's from Basoli, I mean, not so far from Gular and Mandi. And the story here is that Krishna, who is playing his flute here in the center, multiplies himself. And so he can dance with each of the gopis, and they each think they're alone with him. And so here he has multiplied himself multiple times. We have musicians playing in the upper corners. And I think quite interestingly, the host of gods have come to witness this event. And here, again, using these bold color fields that I think are so characteristic of this pre-Mughal moment. And notice also that the figures are not that realism that we saw in the, let me just go back a moment, the realism that we saw, for instance, here with these gopis. They instead are a sort of an idea of what a human being is, and that play between realism and symbolism, I think, is quite important for understanding the Pahari tradition. So I would certainly throw the color field, this idea of breaking the border, these trees that sort of exist outside of the frame, and these gods that come up above, Brahma, Shiva, Surya, the sun, Chandra, the moon, and they are all offering flowers. And if you could see the painting, and you can see it here in this detail. Look at these wonderful flowers that then float down and fill the entire space of the composition. And again, as we zoom in and look at subtle details, one is aware of this idea of this use of three-dimensionality, of trying to raise details off of the surface. And of course, a focus on the natural world, which, I mean, today I think is so important and is evocative and I think defining of this school of painting. The sort of the freshness and exuberance of the living world being a metaphor for godliness and prosperity. Now, one of my favorite works that came in that I was able to work with in these shows is this painting. And for a long time, and in fact, when I first encountered it, it really hadn't been identified. And it was only sort of through this sort of casual reading of the Bhagavata Purana, going through and preparing for the show, that I came across a passage that described the onset of the monsoon. And it tells of Krishna and his brother Balarama sitting at twilight at a moment when the clouds roiled across the sky. And the text actually says these things. And the first rain falls on the earth, replenishing the earth, right? And that the animals and cows ate soft grass that was freshly grown. And you know, here they are eating this grass. And we have these wonderful blooming lotuses. Look at the way that the water is done. Or these small trees here at the foreground. And this sort of like ambiguity of scale, I think, is delightful. Or the depiction of the cows, and this confrontation. Now, all of this, to my mind, is really remarkable because, in fact, this is a one-off painting. It's not that like the Rasalila or Krishna stealing the gopis' clothes. These are compositions that have been repeated over and over again. They are canonical, and you know, one workshop might make a set of sketches, and it goes to another workshop, and you find that same composition or a variant of that composition being produced over and over again. In contrast, this wonderful painting of the beginning of the monsoon, which is an important passage in the Bhagavata Purana, is only known from this single work. And so clearly the patron, perhaps in conjunction with the artist, discussed that they should create this image. This painting was produced, and following this moment, it was never done again. It's a one-off original composition. And I think this happens in the Pahari Hills because of their isolation and because of the remoteness of these tiny kingdoms from the hustle and bustle of the plains down below, and just the scale of production that's happening there. Here, individual works are being produced, and this attention to individuality must have played an important part for the patrons. Here I show you Sid Sen, and this was done around 1720, and interestingly is in the same court where I was just talking about the Mandi master. This is from Mandi. Sid Sen was a very devout Hindu tantric ruler, and you see him standing here. He doesn't look the least bit Mughal. There's a conscious, I think, rejection of Mughal figural style, as he stands here very devoutly, gazing into the eyes of Durga. Durga stands under the space of this tree, right? She is separated from Sid Sen. She has these jackals at her feet. She blows a horn, holds a skull cup with these freshly severed hands in the skull. I mean, if we look closely, I mean, I love her bloodshot eyes. And look at how the paint here is so boldly applied. I mean, you have a layer. Keep in mind, I should say one thing at this point. It's very difficult using this opaque watercolors to mix colors, to do graded shading. And so what you tend to find is layers of paint. So, I mean, we have these big color fields, the wonderful green. I think up here in the leaves, you can sort of see someone laid down a dark green. Then there was this black laid on top of it, and then this lighter green, and then the yellow on top of that. And so given the tiny scale of the paintings, your eye naturally blends these colors, and you have this sense of them being mixed, and yet it's a subtle sort of building of color, layer upon layer. I particularly like this painting. They're very rare, these works by Sid Sen, and he clearly was working with a master who produced artworks that related to his interests and his devotional practices, and that within a generation after his death, this style again disappears. And he oddly, I find his own self-portrait quite disarming, but also unusual and evocative. He stands very much in contrast to a ruler, and here I show you Balwant Singh. And Balwant Singh was in Jasrota, a tiny little kingdom, not far from Gular. And this is a work attributed to Nansuk. And Nansuk is perhaps the most famous artist I'll show you today. Nansuk and his brother Manaku formed a school of painting that then went on to define the painting of Gular and Kangra. The very first painting I showed you tonight with Krishna and Radha is probably the next generation after these great artists worked. And here, Nansuk is created this image of Balwant Singh who stands, and he's under the pavilion that shelters Krishna and Radha, but still they're separated. They sit within this very elaborate architectural space, whereas he's backlit. Backlit by perhaps the lands that he controls, this wonderful ocean, and of course, or lake, and of course here we're seeing very much a reaction to the Mughal precedent, and I think Nansuk is an artist who, though he uses intricate pattern, which fills the space. And you think about how complex all of this pattern work with this throne of the background here, that frames Krishna and Radha. And yet he's very understated. It's very balanced. Nothing is too heavy-handed. The composition has this wonderful lightness about it and elegance, refinement. And his work goes on to I think, be quite profound and important. Certainly at this stage, you should be saying, wow, there seem to be a lot of different aspects of this Pahari tradition. I mean, different schools, different players. And part about it, I think, is that these rulers were aware of the different artists and enjoyed the play of style and supported the creation of such works. Perhaps with the remainder of my time, or at least a chunk of it, I want to shift now and talk about the Ramayana, which is maybe the greatest epic. I mean, it's the ultimate adventure story in India, and it's a story that tells of Rama and Sita, and Sita's abduction by this demon Ravana, and ultimately her rescue. Rama is an avatar of Vishnu, much like Krishna, and is an incarnation of God. And yet, here in this great story of good versus evil, we see a story that captured the attention, really, of everyone. Today, how often is this depicted? My own children. They know the story of the Ramayana backwards and forwards because, of course, they read comic books when they were little, and they're knowing nothing of the religious dimension. It caught their attention, and this is true of everyone in India, really going all the way back, perhaps to the 5th century BC when this text was first written. Here, I open the story actually a little ways into it. Rama has been banished to the forest. His father, owing a boon to one of his 4 wives, agreed to put Bharata, his younger brother, on the throne. And even Bharata recognized Rama's rightful right to rule, and yet he rules as regent. And Rama is banished to the forest for 14 years. Sita insists on coming along, and so does Lakshmana, who we see here, removing a thorn from his foot to the right while Sita fans him. So this is the beginning. They are like lions on a hillside, content in the forest. And in fact, the text goes to great length to talk about how Rama's so pleased to be in the forest, away from the noise of the city. He's able to perform ritual undisturbed. And this scene prefigures the whole story. Done in 1810 in Kangra. I think it's one of the great late masterpieces. 1810 is right at the end. By 1814, this region is invaded by the Gurkhas, and a lot of modern pigments come in. The British have really established themselves in India, and we find these painting traditions in decline. So this is sort of maybe the end of that great tradition, but I think a fabulous work. We have a lot of things that are going to hint at what's to come. Hanuman, this great monkey warrior who will help rescuing Sita, is here down below drinking out of the stream, even though he doesn't yet appear in the text at this point. I mean, so he's been inserted in to sort of anticipate him coming. And when Sita is abducted by Ravana, what happens is a golden deer, who is actually a demon in disguise, lures Rama and Lakshmana off. They leave to hunt this deer, who you can see here. They've captured it. We see their bows, these wonderful arcs of the bows, sort of mirroring the body of Rama. And so all these aspects of the story are present, and yet we are sort of seeing the trio of Rama, Lakshmana, and Sita triumphant at the very beginning of the story. I'll sort of run through the story, and what I'm going to do is sort of pluck various paintings from different time periods and different places that I think make interesting points. For instance, this early painting is Mughal. And the Mughals were interested in the Ramayana because it was this great epic, and commissioned a series of paintings, perhaps in the region of Datia, down on the plains of Rajasthan, for a Mughal patron. And I believe what we see here is Ravana, who has many heads right here. He is sitting in his palace, and this demon Akapana confronts him and says to him, you know, Rama and Lakshmana are out in the Dandaka forest slaying your followers, because these demons, and here you have this great host of demons down below, had been disrupting the sacrifices of the ascetics of the Dandaka forest. And this enrages Ravana, and he decides, Akapana says to him, if you abduct Sita, it will be Rama's undoing. He will fall apart psychologically, and you should stop him. And so they agree. And I think it's quite interesting how they're shown here clasping hands. A wonderful detail of these demons, drawn interestingly out of the Persian world. These sort of these dots, and the way of depicting them, not a type of demon that we find in India, but the Persian form instead. So the story goes on, and here I'm leaping right back to these followers of Nansuk and Manaku that I mentioned, this late generation. This is a 1780 painting, and here's Ravana, and he has traveled from Sri Lanka, and crossed this wonderful ocean which fills 3/4 of the space. It's a wonderfully creative sort of depiction, again, sort of without precedent. This great swirling body of water filled with these aquatic creatures. And he approaches this demon, Marichi, and he says, will you help me, abduct Sita? And Marichi, who was quietly sitting by this body of water meditating, throws up his hands and says, no, this would be your end. You will die, and so will I, if you confront Rama. But sadly, he is convinced, and here he is together with Ravana, and they are going to go off to abduct Sita. In fact, the story goes that Marichi, this demon, is the one who actually takes the form of the golden deer and lures Rama and Lakshmana away. I actually don't have an image of Sita's abduction. It oddly is not often shown. And I have noticed, and I have no basis to say this in any great depth, that scenes that are negative, that are uncomfortable, often are not depicted. And so sometimes we see Ravana approaching Sita, but the abduction tends to be downplayed in these depictions. And I find these paintings to be a great window into how people are understanding this plot. This is a fairly early painting, and its simplicity, I think, kind of is evocative of that. This was done about 1680 to maybe 1710 in Bahu, and it's Rama and Lakshmana, and they are looking for Sita. They don't know that she's been abducted by Ravana, but I think. And oddly, these two figures sit sort of, I think, fairly emotionless, but they're placed within this vast empty space, right? The curving landscape with the moon done with silver, and those little bits of silver, and the stars here in the sky. We get a single tree speaking to the loneliness, the despair. So I mean, we're symbolically representing this idea of Sita's loss. This painting was one that I worked a lot with one of my a wonderful paper conservator at the Metropolitan, Maria Rez Molina, and she did some fabulous infrared and microscopic work on this particular painting, and I think it tells us a lot of how the artist originally conceived, for instance, of the mountain that they sit on. Right here, this wonderful swirling pink form. originally it was much bigger, right? You can sort of see through the paint layers, and it had originally sort of enveloped these two figures and was much more vertical in its creation. They moved the moon. There are all these little adjustments. Using microscopic photography, she was able to, I think, give us a sense for how the paint was applied on this particular image. For example, these uses of really thick, bold colors. I mean, this single paint stroke of ochre and then these layers of red on top of it, or the three-dimensionality of the pearls of his earring, or this little bits of hair. But keep in mind that the head of this figure, must be smaller than half the size of the nail of my pinky. It's a tiny little detail, and the idea being, of course, that your eye blends these colors. Notice also how the paper, this wassaily paper, has been polished and the fibers have been laid down so that these layers of paint can be added. The outline, for instance, of his face, and the demarcation. And here we look at Lakshmana. And I think that one of the remarkable things when you think of these artists laying down these color, they, to outline his ear, which here looks, bold and clumsy, and yet, it's at such a minute scale. Here we can even look closer and see, actually, as the paint dries, these little dimples and air pockets that emerge. Really, I think quite remarkable to see the paintings at this kind of scale. We back out, and of course, all of that vanishes, and you're given a bold and I think striking image. It's one of my favorite paintings of the period, in spite of its simplicity. I mean, it's tempting to really like the complexity and the refinement of the later period, whereas I find this bold and graphic quality quite unprecedented and unique within sort of the painting traditions, certainly of South Asia and elsewhere. I should note that in the early 20th century, Ananda Kumar Swami was a major proponent and one of the early scholars of Indian art. And he brought a lot of this painting to the Boston Museum of Art, to the Met. And at that time in New York City, he was part of Stiglitz's inner circle. And why I've always wondered about these Indian paintings having an impact on modern art that has gone, unresearched and unnoticed. Okay, but I digress. Let me get back to my story. So Sita has been brought to Lanka, and here we have Ravana in his palace. Yeah, I have a detail of Ravana with his 10 heads and many weapons, and he sends these two demons to assess the strength of Rama and Lakshmana's army. Now, after they've realized that that Sita is in Lanka and has been captured by Ravana, they assemble this army of monkeys and bears, and here you can see the bears and monkeys. So these two demons sneak in, and they're trying to count the monkeys and bears, but of course monkeys have the habit of moving around constantly, and so try as they might, they can't really assess the strength, and soon they're discovered, and they're brought before Rama. And here's one of Rama's followers. Actually, one of the sons of Ravana, his name is Vibhishana, and he says, well, these two demons were spying, and Rama says, no, they're not spies. They're ambassadors. They're emissaries of Ravana, and they should be free to walk around and see the armies, and he actually frees them, and you see them here returning. Also, it's kind of interesting here. You have Hanuman and Anganda and some of the generals of the monkey and bear armies sitting to the right. Now, this group of paintings that I'm showing you right here, which actually are right now on view at the Met. I just saw them this morning. Are large format. They're quite unlike the other paintings. They must be 15 inches by maybe 30 inches there, or maybe maybe there, I would say, yeah, 20 inches wide. So a large format series, and they mark the beginning of Monaku's tradition, artistic practice, done about 1725. He's the older brother of Nainsuk, who we were just looking at, and he certainly is influenced by these sort of Mughal ideas that are coming out of Rajasthan, and yet at the same time, notice the curving horizon, and there's a certain the use of the color fields. So he's an interesting artist that sort of bridges these two traditions. With these large format Monaku paintings, one of the great things is that we can sort of see process. Here's an image also done 1725, and it's a passage that actually is not in the classical form of the Ramayana, but is actually from a vernacular from the Punjab hills. And it tells of this monkey warrior on Ganda who flies through the air, crashing over Ravana's palace, and he steals Ravana's crown, which he then brings back. And this is Ravana's son Vibhishana, who Rama then crowns and says, "You are the rightful ruler of Lanka," right? And so from this moment on, this battle to free Sita sort of ensues, and eventually, Ravana will be defeated. Here, though, we can sort of see a moment of underpainting, though. We probably have an initial drawing, and I'm about to show you some drawings. But here, all of the color has been blocked in. And if I go back one slide, here we go. Look at how this palace then, has gold that has been laid onto the surface. The monkeys have been worked. The figures take on, I think, a rather formal quality that is the finished painting, which is only hinted at here. And if we look actually at a drawing, and at the Met, we are very fortunate to have two drawings. I should mention these are works that came with Ananda Kumaraswamy to the Met in 1918. So quite early acquisitions, and sort of mark the beginning of our painting holdings at the Met. And here we see Indrajin. He is another son of Ravana, and he's doing a ritual. We have this group of demons bringing ritual materials, and he's busy conducting this ritual. And what he's able to accomplish in this way is to render himself invisible, and then he flies invisible through the air and attacks Rama and Lakshmana. It's maybe the culmination of this battle, and Indrajit is the most powerful of Ravana's. He's a son. Ravana sends all these various demons to defeat Rama and Lakshmana, and inevitably fails. But here we have this ritual. Now, it's kind of hard to show someone invisible attacking Rama and Lakshmana, and various artists tried different strategies. Here we see them actually defeated, and so many arrows fell that they completely enveloped the two heroes. And look at all the millions of arrows, and even their bodies are covered with this sort of snake-like form, and the arrows are discussed in the text as taking on this quality, and they're fallen. And all of the monkeys and bears are distraught, right? They've been killed, they've been defeated, and in this wonderful drawing, which lacks the formality of the finished paintings, I think we get a real sense of Monaku's hand as an artist. I mean, personally, I like the drawings more than the finished paintings. They're so full of personality and so lively, and I mean, clearly an artist of great skill who just is drawing freehand using a fine brush charged with its black carbon. I mean, it's not like something that can be erased and changed. Although we even have sometimes pencil drawing that precedes this stage of a preparatory drawing. But anyways, we get this wonderful wonderful sense for how this was constructed. Now, this actually super late Kangra painting, maybe done in the 1780s. I sometimes wonder if this last, this is part of a long series. I mean, we date it conventionally to 1790. I think it's after in a sense, the fall of the great artists. I mean, the figural style here, I think, is starting to break up. But it does tell us the story of how Rama and Lakshmana were revived. The text tells us that not only were they filled with arrows and defeated, but also the monkey and bear army. And at that point, Hanuman is sent to the Himalayas to retrieve these herbs that will revive them. And you see him. He goes to the Himalayas and finally he gets to this mountain, and in some forms of the text, the herbs keep disappearing, or he simply can't find them. And so in frustration, he rips the entire top of a mountain off, and here he's flying back with the mountain. He's deposited the mountain here. I think it's kind of great fun. In a way, it's like a big scoop of ice cream or something. Here's the top of the mountain, and you can see the herbs. And he brings them to the great heroes. And here's Lakshmana stretching his arms and revives him. Following this movement, they defeat Ravana and free Sita. Now, I almost wanted to show that image before showing this. This is actually a large-scale painted textile showing Hanuman. It's less narrative, and I think is much more iconic in a way. And across Rajasthan, this is done maybe 1800. Across Rajasthan, Hanuman temples and tantric images of Hanuman were created and remain a very important devotional focus today. Hanuman, you can tell the tantric images, which are rare, because of the embedded text. And here you can see a lot of this text. And here's the mountain he's bringing, which is done in gold. I love the little elephants and things. And he's bringing this back, right? And on his shoulder sits Rama with his bow, right? And we see this diagram in the center of his chest, which has verses in it. And after doing a lot of research on these tantric images, they were used in ritual, and text was placed in the center of Hanuman's chest, often as part of the consecratory moment of use. And very few of these survive because they tend to be consumed in the process of the ritual. Actually, let me go back one and just say one other thing. So he brings the herbs that revive Rama and Lakshmana, but also the army. And here on his tail is the army that goes on to defeat Ravana. And so I think kind of a really quite dramatic and interesting image. Now, this is what we find down on the plains of Rajasthan, these kind of iconic images. And I close here with sort of this scene. This is from Bikaner, a Rajasthani kingdom. So very different in style, I think, from the Pahari works. Very bold. If you think of that Mughal green that I mentioned earlier, you can sort of see it here in the background. And what do we have? We have Rama and Sita. They have returned to Ayodhya. He is now being recognized by his other three brothers. You have Lakshmana holding his bow, and the other two. Hanuman holds his hands in Anjali Mudra and recognizes them. And here we have in a sense, a devotional icon. And like the image of Hanuman I just showed you, this great tantric form, here we see a formal image that is suitable for veneration. And I think quite different from the storytelling images of the hills. I could go on, but I think I've run out of time, and I would like to leave a moment for questions. So
yes, thank you so much, Kurt. have a question from our own Ani Proser. She asks, can you tell us about the inscriptions on the red frame of the 1750 Pahari painting? Are they contemporary?
The last part of what you just said dropped out, but let me go back to the red frame. From the very beginning.
Yes.
Yes. It's no, not this one. Yes, these inscriptions around. Now, it seems from what I can understand, on the back of this image, we actually have this verse, right? Which is telling us who all these figures are. I mean, when you read the verse, it identifies, these three as Kalis and so on. I mean, each figure is identified. But somehow, and there's a sort of a certain amount of debate in the scholarship, but I think it seems logical that these were added later, right? They were put in identifying the figures on the front face of the image, which would seem to be unnecessary, but maybe it had to do with invoking those deities when these set of 70 images of the goddess were used together. Because, I mean, how were they used? Were they laid down? Were they viewed one by one? Perhaps they were laid together to form a complex mandalic kind of structure or a temple type image. Certainly that would be the way a Tibetan image that relates to this kind of format would be used. So, but they're labels.
Wonderful. So I have a question. You had mentioned, you showed us paintings from two different narratives, two different epics and stories. Have you found that there were certain episodes from these narratives that exist more popularly as images rather than text? Or, how popular are some of these episodes?
Yeah, no, the images of Krishna captured people's attention. And we find Krishna sort of shown in contexts of bhakti over and over again. Now, this might be very nuanced, right? I mean, in other words, even if I just go forward in this next little group, I mean, we have conventional scenes like this one, which was very popular down on the plains. But when we look at, and this is another one of those sort of standardized, but if we look at an image like this, which is a one-off, it's still, they're picking out Krishna and they're laying emphasis on him. And we get a lot of images of the public or of figures that could stand in for the public. The Gopas in this instance, these gopis in this example, or a deity. But here we're deviating then from a text, right? So I would say the Bhagavata Purana is the most devotionally important text, though there are these wonderful Gita Govinda images, and there are a big series of the Gita Govinda, which I began with. And then a tremendous number of Ramayana scenes. And we don't find that kind of narrative of the Ramayana anywhere else besides in Pahari. It just dominates the tradition. And I should say also with the Pahari tradition, we don't see lots of scenes of hunting, of kings sitting in their palaces and so on. It is much more devotional in its nature. And then we have these devotional texts being emphasized.
Well, so if there aren't any more questions, Kurt, I want to thank you so much for this lively and engaging talk. Well,
thank you for having me. It's a joy to be able to address these paintings, and I really encourage your audience to come to the Met and see our wonderful paintings. Come to the Walters Art Gallery. I'm sure that you also have works like these on display in a regular way.
Thank you so much, and a big thank you to our digital team for producing this program. And
yes,
finally,
thank you for inviting me.
And finally, an even bigger thank you to all of you, the audience, for sharing in this experience with us. Please be sure to log on to the Walters YouTube channel and other social media channels to enjoy more great programming. Thank you.